Okay, this screencast is going to start with the Treaty of Paris, 1763, so if you have already gotten through this section of the notes, then just fast forward a little bit. We talked about England fighting both the French and the Native Americans during the French and Indian War. That war will end in a British victory, and the treaty that finalizes that war is the Treaty of Paris, 1763. The Treaty of Paris, 1763, specified the following things. The French lost their empire in North America, which means that England or Great Britain will get Canada for themselves. Britain will get all lands east of the Mississippi River, including parts of Spanish Florida. And I know it seems odd that they would get Spanish territory, but just complete side note, the Spanish did help the French side briefly during this war, so they also gave up a little bit of territory. So England, Great Britain gets all land east of the Mississippi, including parts of Spanish Florida. And then Spain gets everything west of the Mississippi River, including all of New Orleans, which is a major port city. Now we know that the natives were aiding the French in this war because the French had good relationships with the Native Americans. I mean, I'm sure the natives would rather all Europeans leave and go back to Europe and leave the natives to themselves in the New World, but if they have to have European settlers in the New World, they'd prefer them to be French. So obviously the natives were not too thrilled that the British won the war and took some territory away from France. And so a Native American chief named Pontiac is going to lead a rebellion against several different British forts and settlements. Now the British were able to defeat the natives and put down this rebellion in pretty quick time, but the king was somewhat concerned about future Native American conflict, so he issued what was called the Proclamation Line of 1763, in which he told in which he told the British colonists in the 13 colonies that they were not allowed to settle west of the Proclamation Line. Now, if you look at the screen, on the screencast, you can see the line is essentially just everything west of the colonies near, like, Virginia, North Carolina specifically. Is basically they were told they weren't allowed to settle west of the Smoky or Appalachian Mountains. And that seems kind of confusing. I know that England would win the war, gain all this territory, put down a Native American rebellion, and then tell the colonists they're not allowed to settle this newly acquired land. But I think that the king, and it's King George III doing this, is just trying to prevent any kind of future rebellion, or not rebellion, but future conflict with Native Americans. So the colonists are not very happy about this, to say the least, because they just fought and won all this land, and now they're being told they can't settle it. We're going to move to the overall legacy of the French and Indian War that's going to cause this large chain reaction of cause and effect events leading to the Declaration of Independence being signed, which we'll talk about in class on Monday. So if you want to pause the screen really quickly and maybe put it to the side, you see the 4 pieces of the legacy of the French and Indian War. I'm going to be briefly expanding on each of those, but they're on the screen. First piece is that the British and colonial troops did not get along. Colonists not obeying the Navigation Acts, number 2. George III leaving a large peacetime army in the colonies, number 3. And then national debt, number 4. So, with the first one, British and colonial troops not getting along. During the French and Indian War, England was sending many British soldiers from England to the colonies to fight in that war. And so you have British-born troops fighting, and you have colonial troops fighting in favor of England during that war, on the side of England during that war. But they are two kind of different sides because of where they're coming from, and they don't really get along that well, and they don't really see eye to eye. The Americans kind of think the British are stuck up and snobby, and truly the British soldiers do kind of look down on the colonists as being a little like less legit and less British, since they're colonials and not truly from England itself. When it says the colonists not obeying the Navigation Acts, remember in Unit 1 that when the Molasses Act was passed, the colonists began smuggling French sugar, kind of bypassing or ignoring that tariff that was put on French sugar. And this is an illegal practice that many British soldiers witnessed, and they essentially went home to Parliament and tattled on the colonists. So they witnessed the colonists doing this. Now, when George III left a peacetime army, this is referring to the army he leaves behind after the French and Indian War was over. Even though the war was over and the colonists and the British side had won, King George III leaves a large number of British soldiers in the American colonies, in the British colonies, and this kind of makes the colonists feel that their king does not trust them. But the most significant effect or piece of legacy of the French-Indian War is the national debt that England was in after the war was over. Even though they were on the winning side, we know that wars cost money. And one of the main ways to generate revenue, if you're a government, is to pass taxes. And so this foreshadows a variety of taxes that the English government will impose on the British colonies in North America. You'll kind of see on my PowerPoint that I'm going to have lots of pictures because I did take a trip to Boston a couple years back, and there's lots of history in that city. And one way to see and visit all that history is by taking a tour of what's called the Freedom Trail, where you are essentially given a map and you follow this little brick line around the city, and there's different points of interest that are different historical points and locations, whether it's Paul Revere's house or the site of the Boston Massacre. And you can kind of see on the picture the little red bricks right above the stone, and that is the little trail you follow. And I'm going to just post some of the pictures I had taken from that trip that correspond to what we're learning about in class. So the first act we're going to talk about that's passed is the Sugar Act. So the Prime Minister in England thought it was time to start taxing the colonies and the colonists to help pay for the war debt England was in. And he also had the goal of ending the smuggling practices that were taking place. So he had Parliament pass what is called the Sugar Act. And the Sugar Act actually reduced the tax on French molasses that was already in place. So it actually reduced the tax. England hoped that the colonists would perhaps stop smuggling the sugar and would be willing to pay a lessened tax. The act also increased the consequences if the colonists were caught smuggling. But the colonists were not happy like England thought they would be about this act, because their biggest complaint is not about the tax itself, but the fact that these taxes exist without representation in Congress. in Parliament, in England. They feel like they should have colonial representatives in Parliament if taxes are going to be placed on them. And that leads to that famous battle cry you all know from the American Revolution, no taxation without representation. The without representation, that's the big part that they're upset with. The next tax that's going to be placed on the colonists is an act called the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act required stamps to be placed on all paper items in the colonies. This included court documents, playing cards, contracts, newspapers. And when I say required stamps, it's kind of similar to like when you have to get stamps for mail, you have to pay an additional fee then, even if it's just a few cents per letter. And so this does cost a little bit of extra money for the sale and purchase of these paper products. That's what the Stamp Act did. And then Parliament also passed the Quartering Act, and you all know quartering references the housing of soldiers. So within this act, colonial governments and citizens had to provide food and housing for British soldiers that were in the colonies. So the colonists are forced to both house and feed British soldiers in their settlements, which does cost a little bit of money and is rather inconvenient. Now, this is very annoying for the colonists. They're getting increasingly frustrated with their English government kind of overly controlling them and exploiting them a little bit. And so we see a group of people develop called patriots. And patriots referred to people who were defender of American rights or defenders of colonist rights. And we are going to see a group of patriots send delegates to New York City to form what was called the Stamp Act Congress. So we see patriots kind of organizing this delegation in New York City, where you have delegates coming from various colonies to represent those colonies in New York, called the Stamp Act Congress. And at the Stamp Act Congress, they actually wrote down a letter to Parliament where they were just listing their grievances and their problems with the way Parliament was governing them. They explained they basically felt that the taxes that were imposed on them were unconstitutional because they were not being fairly represented, and they also made a point to say they were not looking for conflict with England. They wanted compromise with England. They were not looking to rebel and form a new government. They wanted to remain English citizens. They just wanted to be treated fairly. This would be an example of like diplomacy and civil, disagreements and like them trying to work for compromise. Not all patriots were so non-confrontational and civil. Some patriots were a little more radical. There is a group of radical patriots that develops within Boston itself called the Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty were a radical resistance group led by one Samuel Adams. And the Sons of Liberty were a very much more radical group. They would use terrorist-like tactics against British soldiers, and they encouraged boycotts of British goods. Samuel Adams is, side note, the cousin of John Adams, who you all know is second president of the United States. This is a picture of his gravestone in Boston, and I do have a funny Samuel Adams joke. but I will save it for class. So if you watch a screencast and you remember, remind me to tell y'all that joke in class. Parliament will try to compromise with the colonists by deciding later on to repeal, which means to take away, repeal the Stamp Act. And Parliament also has the Sugar Act changed to a even further reduced tax. So they're trying to work with the people a little bit. Parliament does also pass, though, the Declaratory Act, which did state that Parliament had the right to pass laws and taxes on the American colonies. So it's a little give and take, because they're saying, we'll get rid of the Stamp Act, we'll lower the sugar tax, but we do have the right to pass taxes on you in the future. Now there's a new Prime Minister in town a few years later, Charles Townshend. I'm actually not going to require you to know his name, even though the acts that are named after him you will need to know. But essentially this new Prime Minister has zero to no sympathy for the colony, so we see a change of heart within the Parliament. They actually pass a new series of taxes called the Townshend Acts that placed taxes on paper, paint, glass, and tea that was imported into the British colonies. Paper, paint, glass, and tea. And we're basically going to see the Sons of Liberty kind of like up to their old tricks with this one, because they're not happy with Parliament's decision to pass these taxes. But we'll talk about that. So, as I said, the Sons of Liberty are up to their old tricks. Basically, as a result of the Townshend Acts, the colonists start to call for boycott of British goods. Then they would not be paying these taxes. And if you boycott British goods, you're really hurting the British businessmen who are trying to sell these products to the colonies. Because a boycott is when the colonies are refusing to buy those goods that are taxed. And if they don't buy them, then those British companies don't make a profit on them. So because of that, Parliament does decide to remove the tax on all items in the colonies except for tea. Tea is the only tax they keep. And we'll see how that causes trouble in class on Monday. We're going to pick up with these notes in class on Monday. Write down any questions you have, and I hope you all have a good weekend, and I will see y'all on Monday.